Yes, thank you very much. As Rachel's outlined, the Prevent legislation imposes a duty on colleges and universities to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. And what the Prevent duty focuses on is what they call non-violent extremism. And this extremism is defined as opposition to British values. And in the documentation, these are referred to as respect for democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs, and the definition also, definition of extremism also identifies those who call for the death of members of our armed forces. Now, there are a number of problems with defining extremism in this way. In fact, it's very vague. There's nothing particular to Britain about those values. If anybody's heard Theresa May being interviewed on the radio, she's incapable really of expanding on that definition and gets into difficulties when she's asked about what about homophobia, what about members of your party who are homophobic and so on. And there's also a lot of ambiguity around the notion of extremism just more widely in public debate. We've recently had a debate where the political figure considered to be the out there, radical left extremist, defying the Queen, not knowing the words to the national anthem individual, he's the figure who won't press the nuclear button. The moderates and the mainstream figures are the people perfectly prepared to defend British values by indiscriminately incinerating millions of people if the need arises. So, in other words, there's a debate about what extremism means. It's subjective and it's based on opinions and people's political standpoint. And what the Prevent legislation does is it draws on a very particular notion of what extremism is, a very particular notion of what radicalisation is, by drawing on theories developed around this question of radicalisation theory, which is a very contested notion. And the aspect that the government has drawn on is really based on a kind of clash of civilisations view of international politics, and a kind of conveyor belt notion of extremism, that people, that religious ideology can give rise to extremism, that can give rise to terrorism, and that's where the whole stigmatisation of Muslims, which is very particular to the Prevent agenda, and is why the Prevent agenda will provoke and encourage racism as one of its consequences, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But that's why Prevent is based on flawed foundations. You can read plenty of studies critical of radicalisation theory that say this is inadequate for understanding how terrorism develops, how people become terrorists, and many other factors and contexts that need to be taken into account. And this tends to obscure other forms of extremism, notably right-wing extremism, but also to deflect attention away from the crimes committed by states, the British state included, and the role of that in fostering extreme reactions to military intervention overseas. So there are a number of issues and problems with the basis and the content of the Prevent legislation, but it also raises, as Rachel indicated, a fundamental problem for universities, because universities are places where, to quote other sections of the Education Act and the Education Reform Act, universities are required to ensure that academic staff have freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom, to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy or losing their jobs. A report commissioned by Universities UK talked about how can you contest extremism if you can't let it be expressed? So there is something absolutely fundamental to the nature of universities as places where people are free to express ideas, whatever kind of ideas they may be, within the boundaries already established by policies developed by the government and institutions themselves that ensure things like safe spaces and equal opportunities and so on. But there is a threat to that from Prevent. There's a threat to people conducting meaningful research, particularly into terrorism, and therefore UCU has taken a position to oppose and to contest the Prevent agenda. UCU, the lecturers and academic staff union nationally, sees Prevent as a threat to academic freedom, to freedom of speech, that the definition of terrorism and extremism given in the legislation will stifle debate and also political activism and reflection on campus, that it will force people to spy on their learners, that it will target Muslim students, and this is borne out by the studies that have been conducted into the impact of Prevent between 2007 and 2010. Muslims made up 90% of those referred to Prevent's anti-radicalisation programme. So it's something that, on grounds of academic freedom, of the defence of the diversity of our universities, and also for people who have a concern genuinely to challenge dangerous and extremist views, Prevent is entirely counterproductive. And I just want to end really with this, which is that I do research on Islamophobia in France. People might have seen the article today about meat being imposed in school canteens in France as part of the moral panic over halal meat, and that alternatives to pork are not being offered in many schools. And people's reaction to this in the classroom is, well, that could never happen here. People looked at the wake of the Charlie Hebdo massacres and the reaction, the Je suis Charlie reaction, I may disagree with your views, but I'll defend to the death your right to express them and so on. And then the outcome, which saw 8-year-old kids dragged before the courts and the police because they'd said they were a terrorist, even if they didn't know, with the terrorists, even though they didn't know what the word meant, or those who refused to respect the minute's silence, dragged before the police and the courts, and people say, well, that couldn't happen here, and yet we've seen exactly that kind of thing happening, precisely that kind of thing happening under the Prevent agenda. And so I think we need to stimulate and generate debate around Prevent and the danger that it represents. But there's also something that the university authorities need to do. We faced a big battle in 2010 with the imposition of tuition fees and the transformation of the culture of universities, and an attempt by the government to create consumers of students and service providers of lecturers. That was a huge threat to universities. University managers failed the test of that. They failed to oppose that. There is, in some ways, an even more fundamental threat to what universities represent, posed by this legislation. I'm very pleased that there are representatives from senior management here tonight, and it would be brilliant if the senior management at King's took a public position in defence of universities, in defence of academic freedom, and in opposition to all the dangers that the Prevent agenda.
Thank you for that, Jim. You raised a lot of good points. Our next speaker is Moazzam Begg. He is an author, an ex-Guantanamo Bay prisoner, an ex-Belmarsh and Bagram prisoner, and the director of outreach at Cage. So I'll just pass it over to Moazzam Begg.
Yeah, thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, compassionate and most merciful. Gosh, how do you follow all this up? I mean, you guys are going through Prevent, and all I can offer is my experience of Guantanamo. The truth is that when we're talking about what's happening right now, it's almost as if those of us who went through that process that was the most extreme end of the war on terror, when we said we told you so, you all remained silent. I don't mean you as the students, but some of you probably weren't even born when we were in prison, or were very young at least. But everybody was silent. They didn't care. They didn't mind, for example, the 2000 Terrorism Act being passed, of which Schedule 7 is a law by which disproportionately more Muslims are stopped under a port of entry and exit in this country than any other law. They're actually detained without charge or trial at the airports. That's been happening since 2000. There have been 14 pieces of anti-terror legislation passed in this country since 2000. They include the Glorification of Terrorism Act in 2006, under which people in this great land of Shakespeare and Wordsworth and Tennyson have been prosecuted for writing poems. People in this great land of literature, where there are 100,000 publications published every year, have been prosecuted for books that were written in the 12th century AD. We have seen that British intelligence agents and the government at large has been complicit in the rendition and torture of its own subjects and the subjects of other countries. If you look at the case of Shakir Ahmed, it is almost unbelievable that this man, who has a British wife and 4 British children, the youngest of whom is 14 years old and he's never seen his father, is held in Guantanamo Bay by the United States of America, our closest allies. But not only that, he only remained there because of our government and because of the fact that nobody was strong enough or willing enough or courageous enough to hold him to account for being complicit in his torture when his head was smashed repeatedly against a wall in the Bagram detention facility whilst MI6 agents stood and watched and asked questions. If you talk about when David Cameron gave his speech in Birmingham in July of this year, I was shocked because he gave it from the school where my son, my youngest son, goes to, where he attends. In his speech, he said that one of the indicators of extremism is, as was pointed out, a refusal to accept British values. One of those core British values is the rule of law, a refusal, a rejection of the rule of law. And yet, the same son of mine who was going to that school was born when I was in Guantanamo being interrogated by British intelligence agents, where I was held without charge or trial, against the rule of law, against the very presumption of the notion of innocence, which has been done away with since the war on terror began. So by that definition, by that explanation, this government, Cameron himself, who has not held anybody to account for those abuses thus far, is an extremist. If you look at what happened in 2001, 16 men of Middle Eastern origin were detained at high security prison Belmarsh in London and held for 3 years without charge or trial. In 2005, it was found that their detention had been unconstitutional. It was illegal. After the July the 7th bombings happened, the Prime Minister of the day said the rules of the game have changed, and these men, although they were released, were shortly put under the control order scheme, whereby a person will be essentially under house arrest without ever being able to see the evidence against them or to challenge it. That's what was happening and is happening in Britain up until the point of this year, when the Counter-terrorism and Security Act was passed in January and it became law, a legal binding duty upon lecturers, upon teachers, upon people in the National Health Service, upon doctors, and that sacred, privileged relationship between their students or clients or patients now being intruded upon by the government, who are asking them to interpret what they think based upon their narrow understanding of what Islamic extremism is, that they are duty-bound under the pain of law to report these extremists. Now, who are these extremists? Well, Mohammed Farooqv is one of them. Another was a 3-year-old child who was referred to the police because of what was deemed to be parents who were teaching extremism. A 10-year-old child earlier this week was reported on BBC Radio 4 as to he was asking for a prayer room, and they reported this 10-year-old to the police. There have been numerous cases that have come to my organisation, CAGE, about people working in the National Health Service, people working in schools and colleges and universities, people working elsewhere who have been reported by colleagues, not because the colleagues are bad people per se, but because they don't want to be fall foul of the law. They don't know what to do. So if they see a girl who never used to wear the hijab before and now she wears it, well, I think, according to my understanding, she's become radicalized, because radicalization means an adherence to your religion. And radicalization, we know, in the week that the film Suffragette has been released, is a bad thing, right? Because women fighting for the rights to get the vote is a bad thing. Being radical is a bad thing. And that's what we're being taught. De-radicalization programs are really important. But let me tell you something. When I was held in Guantanamo in Camp Echo maximum security isolation block, where I hadn't seen another prisoner for 2 years almost, where I hadn't had contact with my family, including that child who was born when I was in custody, a man came to my cell, and this cell was 8 foot by 6 foot. You couldn't take more than 3 steps in either direction without facing a wall. And he said to me, "Son, let me tell you something. I served as a volunteer, he was an old man, in Vietnam during the war. And I would see my buddies killed by the Viet Cong and by the guerrillas and the North Vietnamese army. And we would take acts of revenge out against them. And the worst one, of course, was the My Lai massacre, in which over 400 men, women, and children were butchered by American soldiers. And I would go back home after having buried my buddies into San Francisco within 24 hours and walk onto the streets, not to a hero's welcome, but to be called a baby killer and a butcher. And the reason why was because I didn't know what was happening outside of my unit's sphere of influence. All I knew was that we were fighting them and they were fighting us. But back home, there were a bunch of punk-ass kids demonstrating on college campuses who'd seen the images of these young children. You know, the iconic image of that young Vietnamese girl with her skin falling off from the napalm that had burnt her body, is fleeing that village. The kids, the college kids, the university kids, were demonstrating on campus saying, "No more, we've had enough." This isn't the reason why America claimed that it was going there. It was to stop the spread of communism, but in fact it became a butcher in the process. 2 million people died in that war. And now today, the places that are supposed to be the bastions of freedom of expression, of thought, of ideas, are now coming under the spotlight of the state, where students are being made to feel like they're suspects. It may begin with people like Mohammed or Farooqv, who are visibly Muslim, but do you seriously think it's going to end there? We've already heard how different groups of people have been targeted, and it will for sure, because power, when left unchecked, can run roughshod, as it has happened many times before. We know from whether it's the MP's accounts and expenses accountability, or whether it's something as deep and as disconcerting as the war on terror. Power does not like accountability, and that is what we must seek. So we need to ask questions, very serious and important questions. What gave the government the right to introduce this law, which, by the way, has been a false and failed policy up until now? And let me give you some statistics so you understand exactly who's saying what about PREVENT. Dal Babu, who was the highest ranking Muslim police officer, recently said, after he retired, that PREVENT is a toxic brand. It is seen as something within the community that is an arm of the state that spies on the community. And nobody likes spies. Sir Peter Fahy, who is the head of Greater Manchester Police, said that because of these new laws now, we are being made into a thought police and are afraid of becoming a police state. That's the head of Greater Manchester Police, which is arguably the second largest city in the UK. I have a friend who advised up until 2013 as a prevent advisor, a historian and someone who worked on counter-radicalization program, who says now that I completely oppose the prevent program. It is a poison chalice. This, my dear friends, is something that, despite all of that, and despite all of the allies, the government allies in prevent, who have turned against it over the period of since it began in 2007 or 8, despite it being a failed policy, has now been made into law. Who allowed that to happen? Who sat by and watched? Who didn't care when all of the other policies and measures were being passed and ridden roughshod over the Muslim community? We didn't give a damn. So now that it's here, and we've allowed it to happen, more of our civil liberties will for sure be eroded as long as we stay silent. Prevent now is law, and opposing it in the way that you want to would probably be illegal, but you must oppose it, at least in word if not in deed. You must call for its repeal. You must call for the other legislations that have essentially made us into something that, or the laws at least, that the Stasi of East Germany during the period of communism would be proud of. People can spy on one another. I can look at the person to my right or my left and say, well, I don't think that they are adhering to my version of British values. I don't think they respect democracy. I don't think they tolerate my views. I don't think that they understand what the rule of law is, so I need to report them to somebody. We are already in a state where we constantly hear, before we even get here. I'm from Birmingham, so it's disconcerting every time I hear it. But if you see or hear anything suspicious, report it to the police. You hear that on the underground every day, several times a day. What does something suspicious mean? What is a suspicious person? Was John Charles Jimenez a suspicious person when he was executed by British agents on the 21st of July? We have to really start asking ourselves some really important questions about where we want to be as a society and what is our role as students. We're told that extremists are bad. But Mohammed K. Gandhiji, was an extremist. Churchill said so. Nelson Mandela was an extremist. He paid 27 years in prison as a price for that privilege. Yet we have statues of both men outside Parliament celebrating their contribution to human civilization. So what is an extremist? We all want to stop anybody being violent to anybody else, whether it's here or it's abroad. But if our government really wants us to denounce violence, perhaps it should lead the way. Perhaps it should say that you either adhere to our view of violence, i.e. our violence is good but everybody else's violence is bad. Or you simply say, as a government, do as we say but not as we do. Because the truth be told, one of the things that's pushing people into extremism is that there's nowhere left to air or to argue or to channel your anger, your dismay, your sorrow at what you see on your TV screens or on your internet phones or on your iPhones and smartphones every single day in Palestine and Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. There has to be a place where these discussions can happen without fear of being targeted by the state as an extremist. After all, isn't that what made Britain, allegedly, a place where people wanted to come to because of its freedoms? Isn't that why so many people have fled their nations and come to Britain to seek a place where they have refuge, where they have the ability to express themselves, where they are supposed to be defended by the law? And don't we celebrate in this country just over over 800 years, we now celebrate still the Magna Carta, of which only 3 clauses are still relevant, of which the most powerful one is that to no man shall justice be denied or delayed except they will be judged by their peers. Isn't that the Britain that we're supposed to be part of? And how is it that we can have a shattered armor today? How is it that we can have people bombed and killed by drone strikes without any legal process? Because that is, for all intents and purposes, a government-sanctioned execution. They may be part of an odious organization calling itself Islamic State, which is an insult to the concept. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we can frighten the entire population and say that the terrorism threat is so great in this country that we need to be watching left and right constantly and being afraid of those who are in front of us and behind us, and particularly those dark-skinned Muslims with beards and hijabs and foreign-sounding names. Another statistic, 0.3% of acts of terrorism carried out in Europe, in Western Europe, between 2013 and 2014 were done by those who call themselves Muslims. That means 99.7% of the acts of terrorism committed in Western Europe were done by people who are not Muslims. Why is there no focus on that? These are important fundamental questions we need to start asking ourselves. The greatest act of terrorism in recent times in Europe wasn't carried out by a Muslim. We are constantly reminded of that and beaten over the head with the fact that 52 men and women were innocently killed on July the 7th by 4 Muslims. But that wasn't the greatest act of terrorism in Europe. Anders Breivik beat that. He killed 72 young students in Norway. And if you look at the ideology that drove him, nobody's talking about that ideology. Not in the way that they're talking about Muslim ideology, and how Muslims appear, and how Muslims talk, and how Muslims behave, and how they dress, and how they eat, and how they pray, how they walk, and how they talk. So we need to start asking serious questions of people in authority, whether it's here, whether it's government, whether it's people in power. We do want a harmonious society. We do want to tolerate each other, but not at the expense of one group. It is high time now that we stand shoulder to shoulder with those people who are being targeted. Because if we don't, for a surety, there'll be nobody left to stand with us. Thank you.